Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you has been buried in Kentucky soil for over 180 years, and there are people who would prefer it stayed that way. In 1847, federal authorities sealed a copper mine in eastern Kentucky and classified the records under circumstances so secretive that even today most of the evidence remains locked away from public view. They told the locals it was structural instability. They lied. What they found in those tunnels would challenge everything you think you know about the lengths people will go to accumulate power and the price they're willing to pay in human suffering. Between 1792 and 1845, the Hartwell family extracted over 2 million pounds of copper from these remote hills, amassing wealth that should have made them legends of American prosperity. Instead, by 1845, every single Hartwell had vanished from existence, leaving behind only their fortune and evidence of systematic human experimentation spanning 3 generations. The copper they mined was so pure it commanded premium prices from Louisville to New Orleans, yet no one could explain how uneducated laborers achieved such remarkable results with primitive equipment. The answer lies not in superior mining techniques, but in their willingness to use human beings as disposable test subjects in one of America's first documented cases of industrial-scale human experimentation. The year 1792 brought Kentucky statehood and a flood of desperate settlers chasing the American dream through the Cumberland Gap. Among them were 3 brothers who carried something far more dangerous than mining tools and frontier ambition. Caleb, Silas, and Jeremiah Hartwell arrived with knowledge inherited from generations of Pennsylvania miners who had died extracting metals from poisoned earth. But where their ancestors had been victims of industrial ignorance, the Hartwell brothers understood exactly what they were walking into. Their father Tobias had died at 43, his lungs blackened by metal dust. Their grandfather Ezekiel had succumbed even younger to what physicians called miner's consumption. Their mother Sarah had perished in childbirth, her body weakened by years of breathing the metallic particles that permeated their home. This legacy of industrial death had forged the brothers into something coldly pragmatic. They understood that in America, wealth was not inherited but torn from the earth with bloody hands, and they had spent their lives learning precisely whose blood would prove most profitable. The isolated valley they claimed sat where 3 creeks converged, creating what locals called the Copper Basin due to distinctive green streaks visible in exposed rock faces. Previous prospectors had dismissed it as too remote, but the Hartwells saw opportunity in that isolation. They needed privacy for what they planned. What made the Hartwell operation unique was not their mining expertise, but their systematic approach to human experimentation disguised as industrial labor. Caleb possessed a sharp business mind and disturbing knowledge of human anatomy that exceeded most trained physicians. His letters, preserved in historical archives, reveal a man who could calculate ore yields and estimate market prices with sophistication that suggested formal education, yet no records exist of him attending school. More unsettling was his detailed understanding of metallurgy and the human cost of metal extraction. Silas provided the physical strength, but Pennsylvania records suggest he had worked as an overseer managing both free and slave labor in extremely dangerous conditions. His expertise in what he euphemistically called labor efficiency would prove crucial when they began expanding beyond simple copper extraction. Jeremiah, despite his youth, possessed an almost supernatural ability to read rock formations and trace mineral veins through solid stone. But he also carried their grandfather's journal containing mining techniques, chemical formulas, and what appeared to be medical observations spanning 3 generations of industrial poisoning. The land they claimed required isolation for good reason. The copper vein they discovered contained naturally occurring arsenic, lead, and mercury in concentrations that made every day spent in those tunnels equivalent to controlled poisoning. Rather than taking precautions, they designed their operations specifically to study the effects. By winter 1794, the first phase of their experiment began producing results that would establish the template for everything that followed. Jeremiah emerged from the deepest shaft complaining of severe headaches and breathing difficulties, symptoms his brothers initially attributed to physical exertion. But within weeks, dark patches began appearing on his skin, starting at his hands and spreading up his arms like some terrible stain seeping from within. Rather than seeking medical attention, Jeremiah began keeping detailed clinical notes about his condition. His journal reveals this was not the desperate documentation of a sick man trying to understand his illness, but the systematic observation of a test subject recording data for future reference. The entries are disturbingly precise. Day 12. Discoloration has reached elbow joint. Tremors in dominant hand interfere with fine motor control approximately 3 hours after emerging from shaft. Breathing difficulty most pronounced in morning hours. Note symptoms consistent with father's condition but progressing more rapidly due to higher concentrations of metallic compounds in Kentucky ore. What makes these entries particularly chilling is their clinical detachment and focus on work productivity. Even as he was dying, Jeremiah was treating himself as a resource to be optimized, rather than a human being to be saved. This established the fundamental principle that would guide their operation. Human suffering was not a tragic side effect, but valuable data to be collected and analyzed. Dr. Marcus Pendleton's examination in February 1795 provided the first outside documentation of what was happening to the Hartwell family, and it revealed something far more disturbing than accidental industrial poisoning. His private journal describes Jeremiah's condition with medical precision, but also records his growing suspicion that the brothers understood far more about metal poisoning than they admitted. When Pendleton inquired about their mining practices, the family became hostile and evasive. Caleb demonstrated knowledge of metallurgy and human anatomy that exceeded the doctor's own education, asking detailed questions about the progression of metal poisoning that suggested extensive prior observation of such cases. The pattern of Jeremiah's condition showed clear signs of systematic exposure designed to maximize effects, while keeping him alive long enough to document the progression. But Pendleton's offers of treatment were not just ignored, they were met with aggressive hostility from all three brothers. Caleb seemed more interested in questioning the doctor about medical details than seeking help for his dying brother. When Pendleton offered to take Jeremiah to Louisville for treatment, Caleb demanded detailed information about the process, recovery time, and whether the effects could be reversed. Most disturbingly, when told the damage was likely permanent, Caleb seemed pleased rather than distressed. The doctor realized they were not seeking to cure the poisoning, they were studying it. The mine was not just producing copper at extraordinary rates, it was generating knowledge about systematic human poisoning that they believed would prove far more valuable than any mineral wealth. Jeremiah's death in spring 1796 marked the successful completion of their first controlled experiment in human toxicology, when his brothers found him convulsing in the deepest part of the mine. His lips and fingernails turned the distinctive blue-black color they had seen in their father's final days. They spent precious minutes documenting his symptoms before attempting aid. His final words, recorded in Caleb's journal, were not pleas for help but clinical observations. Vision narrowing from periphery inward, metallic taste intensifying, muscle control failing in predictable sequence, cognitive function remains clear despite physical deterioration, recommend reduced exposure intervals for future subjects to extend observation period. They buried him in an unmarked grave, but not before conducting what they euphemistically called a final examination. Caleb's medical knowledge allowed him to perform a crude autopsy revealing the extent of metal accumulation in Jeremiah's organs. His notes show the cold precision of a researcher rather than the grief of a brother. Subject expired after 127 days of controlled exposure. Liver shows extensive copper deposits consistent with predicted accumulation rates. Bone tissue displays characteristic lead staining throughout skeleton. Brain tissue examination limited by available tools, but visible mercury deposits in cerebral cortex explain observed neurological symptoms. Recommend extending exposure period for future subjects to better document progression patterns. This was not industrial accident, but deliberate human experimentation, and Jeremiah's death proved their methodology was sound. The discovery that would transform their understanding and expand their operation came while exploring new tunnels after Jeremiah's death. In the deeper galleries, they found evidence of prehistoric mining operations, crude stone tools, and partially excavated chambers suggesting indigenous peoples had been extracting metal from these hills for centuries. More important, Neatly, they found skeletal remains scattered throughout the tunnels, bones bearing the same distinctive green staining they were beginning to see on their own skin. These ancient remains suggested the toxic effects had been claiming victims for generations, but they also revealed something crucial. Survival was possible for those who approached the poisoning systematically. Among the scattered bones, Caleb found complete skeletons showing evidence of surviving metal poisoning for extended periods, individuals who had clearly lived with toxic effects for years rather than months. These remains suggested that with proper management and careful exposure control, it was possible to survive long enough to extract significant wealth, provided one accepted the eventual cost. This discovery transformed their understanding completely. They were not simply dying from industrial accident, but participating in a natural selection process ongoing for centuries. Those who could manage the poisoning systematically would survive long enough to profit. Those who couldn't would join the collection in the deeper tunnels. The deaths were not tragic accidents, but evolutionary pressure, and they had found the key to survival. By 1797, both surviving brothers showed symptoms similar to Jeremiah's, but they had also begun implementing what they had learned from the ancient remains. Their operation expanded beyond simple mining to include systematic human experimentation using carefully selected subjects. Local residents began reporting disturbing activities around the mine, strange sounds echoing from deep underground that were not typical mining noise but something far more unsettling. Martha Hensley, whose family farmed adjacent land, described hearing children crying from within the earth. Not crying like adults cry when they're hurt or angry, she testified years later, but the sound children make when they're in terrible pain and there's no one to help them. It would go on for hours, echoing up from deep in the earth like voices from hell itself. When her husband investigated, Caleb met him with a rifle and claimed the sounds were equipment settling in tunnels, but Martha knew better. Equipment doesn't cry for its mother, and it doesn't scream in the voices of young ones begging for help. Other neighbors reported seeing small figures working in the mine at night, children laboring alongside adult Hartwell men under conditions no child should endure. When approached by curious locals, these children would vanish into tunnels so quickly witnesses questioned what they had seen. But multiple independent testimonies described the same phenomenon, children working after dark, appearing malnourished and sickly, terrified of contact with the outside world. The systematic nature of their expanded operation became clear through purchasing records that revealed the true scope of their activities. Samuel Wickham, who operated the nearest general store, reported that the Hartwells occasionally bought supplies inappropriate for mining, chains, locks, medical instruments, and large quantities of restraint devices. When questioned, Caleb claimed these were needed for equipment maintenance or worker safety, but Wickham noted they never brought workers to town and went to great lengths to keep their labor force hidden. Traveling merchants described seeing children and young adults bearing obvious signs of metal poisoning. Characteristic skin discoloration, tremors, and physical deformities from chronic toxic exposure. Caleb would explain these were family members who had inherited the family condition, but the numbers suggested a family tree far more extensive than public records indicated. Most disturbing was the realization that despite evidence of thriving operations and substantial copper production, no records existed of the Hartwells selling ore through official channels. Their copper was disappearing into the American economy through routes so well hidden that even experienced investigators couldn't trace them. Investigation of shipping records revealed someone had been moving copper through the Ohio River system in quantities matching estimated Hartwell output, but sold under false names through intermediaries with no apparent connection to the family. The sophistication of this smuggling operation suggested the Hartwells were part of an organized criminal enterprise with connections throughout the regional economy. By 1825, local folklore had transformed the abandoned claim into legend, but the consistency of disturbing reports suggested something remained active in the mine's depths. Children were warned never to play near sealed entrances, and travelers reported hearing voices calling for help from underground. More unsettling were strange smells emanating from sealed mine shafts, the sickly sweet odor of decay mixed with metallic tang of copper and other minerals. Local residents living downwind reported that during certain weather conditions, the smell became so overwhelming they were forced to seal windows and remain indoors. Chemical analysis conducted much later revealed these odors were consistent with human remains decomposing in environments with high metallic compound concentrations. The breakthrough that would unravel the full scope of Hartwell secrets came in 1834 when Louisville and Nashville railroad construction brought professional engineers into eastern Kentucky for the first time. Thomas Wickham, chief engineer for the railroad project, was surveying potential routes when his team's drilling operations intersected what they assumed were natural limestone caverns. Instead, they discovered an extensive network of artificial tunnels connecting to the original Hartwell mine, a subterranean complex far more sophisticated than anything frontier miners should have been capable of constructing. The tunnels extended for miles in all directions, connecting multiple surface locations and suggesting the Hartwell operation had been active across a much larger area than anyone suspected. If you're starting to understand the true scope of what happened in those Kentucky hills, comment "The Mine Remembers" below. And if this knowledge is changing how you see the hidden history beneath America's prosperity, comment it again. Lock in your awakening to these buried truths. The railroad engineers' discovery revealed the Hartwell operation had been far more extensive and sophisticated than surface evidence suggested. The tunnel network they uncovered stretched for miles underground, connecting multiple surface locations and creating a subterranean complex that dwarfed anything frontier miners should have been capable of constructing. Professional geological survey revealed these were not natural formations but carefully engineered passages designed for moving large quantities of material and people without surface detection. The sophistication suggested either extensive formal engineering training or assistance from individuals with advanced technical knowledge. More disturbing was evidence that the tunnels had been actively maintained and used for decades after the supposed abandonment of the mine. Fresh tool marks, recently burned torch brackets, and clear signs of regular foot traffic indicated the underground network remained operational long after official records claimed the Hartwell family had vanished. Railroad engineers found multiple chambers designed for specific purposes, some clearly intended for ore processing, others for storage, but several showed evidence of being used for purposes that had nothing to do with mining. These chambers contained restraint systems, drainage systems designed to handle large quantities of liquid, and ventilation systems that suggested extended human occupancy under controlled conditions. The discovery forced investigators to confront the possibility that the Hartwell operation had never truly ceased but had simply moved entirely underground, continuing activities that surface authorities believed had ended decades earlier. Detailed exploration of the tunnel complex revealed evidence of systematic human experimentation on a scale that exceeded even the most disturbing surface discoveries. Multiple chambers contained what could only be described as primitive laboratory equipment: scales for measuring precise quantities of metallic compounds, apparatus for controlling exposure to toxic materials, and detailed record-keeping systems tracking the progress of multiple subjects over extended periods. The records found in these underground chambers, written in multiple hands over several decades, documented experiments involving dozens of individuals of various ages and backgrounds. The documentation was methodical and scientific, tracking exposure levels, symptom progression, survival rates, and the effectiveness of different approaches to managing metal poisoning. These were not the desperate notes of people trying to understand accidental poisoning, but the systematic records of researchers conducting controlled experiments on human subjects. What made these discoveries particularly chilling was evidence that the experimentation had continued well into the 1840s, involving subjects who had clearly been kept in the underground chambers for extended periods. The logistics of maintaining such an operation, providing food, managing waste, controlling subjects, and disposing of bodies, required resources and organization far beyond what three frontier miners could have achieved alone. This suggested the Hartwell brothers had been part of a larger network, possibly connected to medical or scientific institutions that provided support and guidance for their activities. The most disturbing discovery came in the deepest chambers where investigators found evidence of what appeared to be selective breeding programs designed to produce subjects with specific characteristics useful for experimentation. Records indicated the Hartwells had been systematically acquiring children and young adults, not randomly but according to specific criteria related to age, physical condition, and family medical history. They were particularly interested in individuals whose families had histories of surviving industrial poisoning, suggesting they were trying to identify genetic factors that might confer resistance to metal toxicity. Documentation found in these chambers included detailed genealogical records tracing family histories across multiple generations, medical observations about inherited characteristics, and systematic breeding records that treated human beings like livestock. The scope of this genetic selection program suggested connections to institutions or individuals with advanced knowledge of heredity and human biology, concepts that were only beginning to be understood by mainstream medicine during this period. But perhaps most horrifying was evidence that this selective breeding program had been successful. The later records documented individuals who could survive exposure levels that had killed earlier subjects, suggesting the Hartwells had actually succeeded in developing human subjects with enhanced resistance to metal poisoning. These enhanced individuals represented the culmination of decades of systematic experimentation, living proof that human beings could be deliberately modified through selective breeding and controlled poisoning to become more useful industrial resources. The financial records discovered in the underground chambers revealed the true scope and purpose of the Hartwell operation. Far from being simple miners who had stumbled into wealth, they were operating a sophisticated enterprise that generated revenue from multiple sources. Yes, they were selling copper through complex smuggling networks, but they were also selling something far more valuable: detailed documentation of human responses to systematic poisoning. Medical institutions, industrial operations, and government agencies were purchasing Hartwell research data to inform their own activities involving human exposure to toxic materials. The brothers had essentially created America's first human experimentation laboratory, generating scientific data that was being used to optimize industrial processes across the country. Their research was informing decisions about worker safety, exposure limits, and the acceptable human cost of various industrial operations. The Hartwell data was particularly valuable because it documented long-term effects of exposure that could not be ethically studied through conventional medical research. By systematically poisoning subjects over extended periods and documenting every stage of deterioration, they were providing information that industrial leaders desperately needed to calculate the true cost of their operations. The financial records show payments from mining companies, chemical manufacturers, and government agencies that dwarfed the revenue from copper sales. The Hartwells were not just extracting wealth from the earth, they were extracting it from human suffering and selling it to the highest bidders across America's emerging industrial economy. The network of customers purchasing Hartwell research extended far beyond what investigators initially suspected, reaching into the highest levels of American industrial and political leadership. Payment records revealed transactions with individuals whose names would later become synonymous with American industrial power: early chemical manufacturers, railroad companies, textile mills, and government agencies responsible for managing large workforces. These customers were not simply purchasing abstract research data, but specific information about managing human resources under toxic conditions. They wanted to know how long workers could be exposed before permanent damage occurred, what warning signs indicated impending disability, and how to maximize productivity from poisoned workers before they became completely useless. The Hartwell research provided precise answers to these questions based on systematic observation of human subjects under controlled conditions. Industrial leaders could use this information to calculate exactly how much human suffering was acceptable to achieve specific profit margins. The moral implications were staggering. The Hartwell operation was not an isolated case of frontier brutality, but part of a systematic approach to optimizing human exploitation across America's industrial economy. The success of major American corporations during the 19th century was built partly on knowledge gained through systematic human experimentation conducted in the Kentucky hills. Every major industrial accident, every case of worker poisoning, every decision to ignore safety precautions was informed by data purchased from the Hartwell operation. The scope of institutional involvement became clear when investigators discovered correspondence between the Hartwells and representatives of what would later become major American universities and medical institutions. These letters, written in careful code but decipherable with effort, discussed the transfer of subjects for more detailed study, the sharing of experimental techniques, and coordination of research activities across multiple locations. The Hartwell operation was not isolated, but part of a network of human experimentation sites operating throughout the American frontier during the early 19th century. Each site specialized in different aspects of human experimentation, some focused on the effects of specific toxic materials, others on surgical techniques, still others on psychological manipulation and control. The Hartwells had carved out a niche as specialists in systematic poisoning, but they were sharing information and techniques with researchers conducting equally horrific experiments elsewhere. This network represented a shadow scientific establishment operating parallel to legitimate medical institutions, but focused on research that could not be conducted through ethical means. The participants included individuals who would later become respected figures in American medicine and science, suggesting that the foundation of 19th century American medical knowledge included significant contributions from systematic human experimentation. The ethical boundaries that supposedly separated legitimate research from criminal activity were far more permeable than official histories acknowledge. The children discovered in the deeper chambers represented the culmination of the Hartwell breeding program, individuals who had been specifically bred and trained from birth to serve as optimal experimental subjects. These children showed genetic modifications that enhanced their survival under toxic conditions, but they had also been psychologically conditioned to accept systematic poisoning as normal. Documentation revealed that these children had been raised in the underground chambers, never seeing natural light or experiencing normal human contact outside the experimental context. They had been trained to view their role as test subjects as a privilege, indoctrinated with beliefs that made them willing participants in their own systematic destruction. The psychological conditioning was as sophisticated as the genetic selection, involving techniques that would later be recognized as advanced forms of mind control. These children believed they were part of a sacred mission to advance human knowledge, that their suffering served a higher purpose that justified any amount of pain. They had been conditioned to report their symptoms accurately, to submit to painful procedures without resistance, and to view their inevitable death as a graduation to a higher state of existence. The success of this psychological conditioning suggested the Hartwells had access to knowledge about human psychology that exceeded anything available to mainstream practitioners during this period. They understood how to break down individual will, rebuild personality according to specific requirements, and maintain psychological control over subjects across extended periods of systematic abuse. The final phase of the Hartwell operation involved the systematic elimination of evidence and the transfer of their most valuable research subjects to other locations within the network. As federal authorities began investigating the region in the 1840s, the Hartwells implemented what appeared to be a carefully planned exit strategy. Rather than simply abandoning their operation, they spent months transferring the most successful experimental subjects to other facilities, destroying records that might reveal the extent of their network and eliminating witnesses who could testify about their activities. The mass graves discovered by Samuel Crawford represented not just the victims of their experiments, but a deliberate effort to conceal the true scope of their activities. The systematic arrangement of the burial sites suggested they had been prepared in advance as part of an organized cover-up operation. But the transfer records found in the deepest chambers revealed that dozens of their most valuable subjects, particularly the children who had shown enhanced resistance to poisoning, had been moved to other facilities before the final shutdown. These individuals represented the successful culmination of decades of research, living proof that human beings could be systematically modified to serve industrial purposes more effectively. The network that had supported the Hartwell operation provided alternative locations where these enhanced subjects could continue to serve research purposes, ensuring that the investment in their development would not be lost. The disappearance of the Hartwell family was not a mysterious vanishing, but a plan. Had transitioned to new roles within the larger network of human experimentation that their Kentucky operation had helped to establish. The federal response to the Hartwell discoveries revealed the extent to which government agencies were complicit in the network of human experimentation. Rather than conducting a thorough investigation and prosecuting those responsible, federal authorities moved quickly to classify all evidence and suppress information about what had been discovered in the Kentucky hills. The speed and efficiency of this cover-up suggested it had been planned in advance, with procedures already in place for managing situations where human experimentation sites were discovered by unauthorized personnel. Documents that survived the subsequent destruction reveal that federal agencies were not shocked by the Hartwell discoveries, but had been expecting them. Government representatives arrived at the site with specific instructions about which evidence to preserve, which to destroy, and which individuals to transfer to federal custody. This was not an emergency response to an unexpected discovery, but the implementation of existing protocols for managing exposed elements of a larger program. The classification of Hartwell evidence under national security provisions revealed that the systematic human experimentation was not considered a criminal matter, but a protected government activity. The research data generated by the Hartwell operation was too valuable to lose, even if the exposure of the site required shutting down this particular facility. Federal agencies moved quickly to secure the most important research materials and transfer them to more secure locations where the work could continue without risk of public exposure. The legacy of the Hartwell operation extended far beyond the Kentucky hills, influencing American industrial practices and medical research. Throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, the techniques developed for managing systematic human poisoning became standard practices in industries across the country, implemented with full knowledge of their human cost but justified by the economic benefits they provided. The psychological conditioning methods pioneered in the underground chambers were adapted for use in managing large industrial workforces, creating compliant populations of workers who would accept dangerous conditions without resistance. The genetic selection principles discovered through the breeding programs influenced approaches to immigration policy, labor recruitment, and social control that shaped American society for generations. Most significantly, the network of human experimentation sites established during the early 19th century evolved into the institutional framework that would later support even more extensive programs of systematic human abuse. The organizational structures, funding mechanisms, and cover-up procedures developed to support operations like the Hartwell mine provided the foundation for programs that would eventually encompass thousands of subjects across dozens of sites. The moral boundaries that had been crossed in the Kentucky hills established precedents that made subsequent atrocities seem less extreme by comparison. Each new program could be justified by pointing to previous successes, each new level of abuse normalized by reference to what had already been accepted as necessary for progress. The economic impact of Hartwell research on American industrial development cannot be understated. The data generated through systematic human experimentation provided American manufacturers with competitive advantages that shaped the global economy throughout the 19th century. By understanding precisely how much human suffering their operations could inflict without losing workforce productivity, American companies could optimize their processes in ways that foreign competitors could not match. The willingness to treat human beings as disposable resources, informed by scientific data about the limits of human endurance, allowed American industry to achieve profit margins that seemed impossible through conventional business practices. This economic advantage, built on systematic human experimentation, contributed to America's emergence as a dominant industrial power during the 19th century. The wealth generated through optimized human exploitation provided capital for further industrial expansion, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where success built on human suffering generated resources for even larger-scale operations. The Hartwell operation was not an aberration, but a crucial component of the economic system that powered American industrial growth. The copper extracted from those Kentucky hills represented only a tiny fraction of the wealth generated through systematic application of the research conducted in the underground chambers. The medical establishment's incorporation of Hartwell research reveals how easily systematic human experimentation became normalized within supposedly ethical institutions. Universities and medical schools that received Hartwell data did not question its origins but simply integrated the findings into their curricula and research programs. Students learning about the effects of toxic exposure were studying information derived from systematic poisoning of unwilling subjects. But this ethical compromise was never acknowledged or addressed. The normalization of research derived from human experimentation established precedents that influenced medical ethics throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Physicians trained with knowledge gained through systematic abuse developed professional attitudes that made subsequent ethical violations seem less problematic. The boundaries between legitimate research and criminal experimentation became increasingly blurred as institutions accepted that certain types of knowledge could only be gained through methods that violated basic human rights. The success of medical treatments developed using Hartwell data created pressure to continue similar research, leading to expansion of human experimentation programs throughout the American medical establishment. Each success justified further abuse. Each breakthrough provided evidence that systematic human experimentation was not just acceptable but necessary for medical progress. The psychological techniques developed in the Hartwell chambers for managing unwilling subjects became templates for social control systems implemented throughout American society. The methods used to break down individual will and rebuild personality according to specific requirements were adapted for use in prisons, mental institutions, schools, and industrial facilities. The understanding of human psychology gained through systematic abuse provided tools for managing large populations without relying on physical force alone. The conditioning techniques that had made children willing participants in their own destruction proved equally effective for creating compliant adult populations who would accept exploitation without resistance. These psychological control methods became integral components of American institutional culture, shaping approaches to education, criminal justice, and labor management that persist to this day. The normalization of systematic psychological manipulation, pioneered through human experimentation, created populations that were easier to control but also more susceptible to further abuse. The success of these techniques encouraged their expansion and refinement, leading to increasingly sophisticated methods of social control that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. The network of institutions that supported the Hartwell operation provided the organizational framework for systematic human abuse that extended throughout American society. The coordination mechanisms developed to manage multiple experimentation sites, share research, data, and transfer subjects between facilities created efficient systems for large-scale human exploitation. These organizational innovations were adapted for use in other contexts where systematic abuse served institutional purposes. The funding mechanisms that supported human experimentation were refined and expanded to support even larger programs, creating economic incentives for institutions to participate in systematic human abuse. The cover-up procedures developed to protect human experimentation sites from exposure became standard practices for managing any institutional activity that violated public ethical standards. The integration of systematic human abuse into respectable institutions created a parallel system of power that operated alongside official authority structures but remained hidden from public oversight. This shadow system provided mechanisms for implementing policies and conducting activities that could not be publicly acknowledged but served the interests of powerful economic and political groups. The transformation of research subjects through systematic experimentation revealed possibilities for human modification that influenced American approaches to social engineering throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The successful creation of individuals with enhanced resistance to toxic conditions proved that human characteristics could be systematically altered through controlled environmental exposure. This knowledge encouraged expansion of programs designed to modify human populations according to specific requirements, leading to systematic efforts to engineer entire communities for particular purposes. The techniques developed for genetic selection and breeding were applied to immigration policy, reproductive regulation, and social stratification systems that shaped American demographics for generations. The psychological conditioning method, SS, were implemented in educational systems, creating populations with modified beliefs and behaviors that served institutional rather than individual interests. The success of these modification programs encouraged their expansion and refinement, leading to increasingly ambitious efforts to reshape human nature according to institutional requirements. The boundaries between legitimate social policy and systematic human experimentation became increasingly blurred as modification techniques were normalized within respectable institutions. The economic incentives that made the Hartwell operation profitable created market forces that encouraged expansion of systematic human experimentation throughout American industry. Companies that utilized research derived from human abuse gained competitive advantages that forced their competitors to either adopt similar practices or lose market share. This created systemic pressure for the normalization of systematic human exploitation across entire industries, making ethical business practices economically unsustainable. The financial success of operations like the Hartwell mine attracted investment capital that funded expansion of human experimentation programs, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where success built on human suffering generated resources for even larger-scale abuse. The integration of systematic human exploitation into standard business practices created economic dependencies that made it impossible to eliminate these programs without disrupting entire industries. The wealth generated through optimized human abuse became integral to American economic growth, creating stakeholder groups with powerful incentives to protect and expand systematic exploitation regardless of human cost. The political protection that surrounded the Hartwell operation reveals how systematically human experimentation became integrated into American government policy at the highest levels. The rapid classification of evidence and suppression of investigations was not an aberrant response, but the implementation of established procedures for protecting systematic human abuse when it served government interests. The network of human experimentation sites operated with government knowledge and support, providing research data that informed policy decisions about military strategy, industrial development, and social control. Government agencies that utilized research derived from systematic human abuse became stakeholders in the continuation and expansion of these programs, creating institutional incentives for protecting and supporting systematic exploitation. The normalization of government-sponsored human experimentation established precedents that influenced American policy throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, making subsequent programs seem less extreme by comparison. The integration of systematic human abuse into government operations created parallel authority structures that operated outside democratic oversight but wielded significant influence over official policy. The cultural impact of the Hartwell operation and similar programs shaped American attitudes toward human worth and dignity in ways that persist to this day. The normalization of systematic human exploitation within respectable institutions created cultural acceptance for treating certain populations as disposable resources rather than human beings with inherent rights. The success of programs that generated wealth through systematic abuse created cultural beliefs that associated prosperity with the willingness to sacrifice human welfare for economic gain. The psychological conditioning techniques developed through human experimentation influenced broader cultural patterns of thinking and behavior, creating populations more susceptible to manipulation and control. The integration of systematic human abuse into American institutional culture created expectations that progress required human sacrifice, that certain types of knowledge could only be gained through systematic exploitation, and that ethical considerations were luxuries that successful societies could not afford. These cultural attitudes, established through programs like the Hartwell operation, provided the moral foundation for subsequent systematic human abuse on even larger scales. The technological innovations derived from Hartwell research contributed to American industrial and military capabilities that shaped global politics throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The techniques developed for managing systematic human poisoning were adapted for chemical weapons development, providing American military forces with capabilities that influenced international conflicts. The organizational methods developed for coordinating human experimentation sites were applied to intelligence operations, creating systematic approaches to information gathering and population control that enhanced American geopolitical power. The psychological manipulation techniques were adapted for propaganda and social control operations, providing tools for influencing foreign populations and managing domestic dissent. The genetic selection principles were incorporated into population management programs that influenced American immigration and demographic policies for generations. The integration of research derived from systematic human abuse into American technological and military capabilities created competitive advantages that contributed to American emergence as a global superpower, but built these advantages on foundations of systematic human exploitation. The institutional learning that occurred through programs like the Hartwell operation created organizational knowledge about systematic human abuse that was preserved and transmitted across generations of American leadership. The techniques, procedures, and organizational structures developed for managing large-scale human experimentation were documented and refined, creating institutional memory that enabled subsequent programs to achieve even greater scales of systematic exploitation. The lessons learned about cover-up procedures, funding mechanisms, and political protection were incorporated into standard operating procedures for managing sensitive government operations. The normalization of systematic human abuse within institutional culture created expectations that certain types of objectives could only be achieved through methods that violated basic human rights, making subsequent ethical violations seem inevitable rather than aberrant. The success of programs built on systematic human experimentation created institutional incentives for continuing and expanding these approaches regardless of human cost. The organizational infrastructure developed to support human experimentation sites like the Hartwell operation provided templates for systematic human abuse that influenced American institutional practices throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The contemporary relevance of the Hartwell operation becomes clear when examining how the techniques, organizational structures, and moral compromises developed in those Kentucky hills continue to influence American institutions today. The normalization of systematic human exploitation for institutional benefit established precedents that shape corporate behavior, government policy, and social attitudes in ways that most people never recognize. The psychological manipulation techniques pioneered through human experimentation evolved into sophisticated methods of social control that operate throughout contemporary society, influencing everything from advertising strategies to educational curricula to political campaigns. The organizational structures developed for coordinating systematic human abuse provided templates for managing large-scale operations that violate public ethical standards while maintaining plausible deniability. The economic incentives that made human experimentation profitable created market forces that continue to encourage systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations through mechanisms that have become normalized within respectable institutions. Understanding the historical development of these systems through cases like the Hartwell operation provides crucial insight into how contemporary systematic abuse operates and why it proves so difficult to identify and eliminate. The evidence suggests that programs derived from the Hartwell operation and similar human experimentation sites never truly ended but evolved into more sophisticated forms that operate below the threshold of public awareness. The institutional infrastructure developed to support systematic human abuse provided foundations for subsequent programs that achieved even greater scales of exploitation while maintaining better cover-up procedures. The organizational knowledge gained through managing human experimentation sites was preserved and transmitted through government agencies, academic institutions, and corporate entities that continued to utilize these techniques for their own purposes. The normalization of systematic human exploitation within American institutional culture created environments where subsequent abuse programs could operate with minimal risk of exposure or accountability. The economic incentives that made human experimentation profitable evolved into market forces that continue to encourage systematic exploitation through mechanisms that have become integral components of American economic and social systems. The psychological manipulation techniques developed through human experimentation were refined and expanded into comprehensive social control systems that influence population behavior on massive scales while remaining largely invisible to those being manipulated. The true horror of the Hartwell operation lies not just in what happened in those Kentucky hills between 1792 and 1845, but in how it established patterns of systematic human exploitation that became normalized within American institutional culture and continue to operate today. The techniques developed for managing unwilling experimental subjects evolved into sophisticated methods of social control. The organizational structures created for coordinating human abuse provided templates for systematic exploitation that operate throughout contemporary society. The economic incentives that made human experimentation profitable created market forces that continue to encourage the treatment of human beings as disposable resources. The moral compromises that enabled systematic abuse established precedents that make subsequent violations of human rights seem less extreme by comparison. Understanding this history reveals how systematic human exploitation became integrated into the foundations of American power, creating dependencies that make it difficult to eliminate without disrupting entire systems of economic and political control. The Hartwell family's legacy extends far beyond their abandoned mine, influencing every aspect of contemporary American society through mechanisms that most people never recognize. But recognition is the first step toward breaking free from systems of control that have operated for generations through carefully maintained ignorance. Now that you know, you can never unknow. The question is what you choose to do with this knowledge that was never meant to reach your ears.